Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be diving right in to how to score primaries with lone operatives and characters. So typically when people think of scoring primary objectives, we think of tough units that can sit on an objective and survive out in the open essentially for at least one round. And sometimes even longer depending on how tough that unit is. However, those units tend to be pretty expensive, and oftentimes, in the case of units like Wraithblades, they don't really offer much else to the battle besides just sitting on a primary objective. And even so, that's only going to be one objective in no man's land that you have secured. There's two other ones that your opponent will probably get, and of course, even if you cap one objective in the middle and your home objective all game long, that's still not enough in most cases to max your primary victory points. And typically, due to the nature of Eldar armies being mostly fragile units with maybe one or two tough units to capture these primary objectives, it's going to be hard for the rest of our army to actually capitalize on those primaries. However, there are some cheeky ways that we can actually score pretty consistently with lone operatives and other characters in our roster. So in this video, I'm going to dive into that and talk about why lone operatives and characters can actually score you a bunch of victory points if you know how to use them. So the first thing we're going to be talking about in today's video is going to be a refresh on what the lone operative rule does. We're going to be talking about that a little bit. I'm also going to be diving into the Phoenix Gem and other revive abilities that we have available to us. I'm going to then be talking about the ingredients and conditions necessary to score primary objectives with characters, and lastly, how to position yourself for success in game, and of course, some examples to go along with it. Okay, so what does lone operative actually do in game? So basically what it is enemy units outside of 12 inches of the target with lone operative cannot target it with range attacks. That means if you have a character like a Death Jester and you have an enemy unit 19 inches away from you, they are not going to be able to target your Death Jester with range attacks. Now, of course, this is a very powerful ability that makes your characters really hard to snipe at range, with their range attacks, that is. Now, things it doesn't work against are abilities, and things like Doombolt, for example, that don't count as range attacks. If it doesn't count as a range attack, then unfortunately the lone operative rule doesn't affect it. So a quick disclaimer for you guys, if you are going against Thousand Suns or somebody with some sort of ability that has a range of greater than 12 inches that wants to, kind of target your characters with this, some of the tactics described in this video are going to have to be rethought a little bit. And you're definitely going to have to position your characters differently in order to have success. Now, another thing that comes into play when talking about characters scoring on primary objectives is, of course, the Phoenix Gem and other revive abilities. This item and the abilities that share the same rules as it allow the character to respond with full runes remaining at the end of the phase on a 2+. So in most cases, you are going to get it off, but in some games, unfortunately, you're going to have that unlucky one. It does happen. It's happened to us all. We all know how it feels, but it is a tiny bit of a risk. Now, the other potentially negative thing about this is it counts as destroyed for objective and rule purposes. It does count as a double assassinate. So, if your opponent is able to kill you twice with the Phoenix Gem, shoots you and then assaults you, after you get up at the end of the shooting phase, that will be a double assassinate. So that is an issue you will have to deal with and, work around if you come across it. Now, the other thing is that a destroyed unit that gets up as a result of these special rules gets up as close as possible to the location it was destroyed at outside of enemy engagement range. So opponents can use this to nudge you off objectives. And basically what they do is when they consolidate back towards the center of the objective, they spread out their guys as much as possible to nudge you off of that objective. Now remember, you have to go as close to the original position as possible. So with cheeky enemy movement or consolidation, they can actually push you outside of objective range. And, then you're obviously not going to have OC on that objective, which can be unfortunate. So when using the Phoenix Gem, you have to keep in mind that you really don't want to be assaulted on an objective, because oftentimes what's just going to happen is, yes, you'll survive, but you'll lose your OC on that objective because your enemy will be able to push you off. Okay, so what are the ingredients and conditions necessary to score primary with characters? So here are the ingredients that you need to make sure that primary objective holding characters are a success and can actually hold those objectives. So first of all, you need access to expendable screening units, things like swooping hawks and rangers and so forth. You need good target priority. You need to be able to kill things that can deal with your lone operatives very effectively. Really fast units are going to be exceptionally dangerous because they can get within 12 easily, and also units that have high firepower as well. Typically, if you're going against something like Dark Eldar, you want to be able to target things like Reavers and stuff like that, or their fast elements. You know, things that could easily pop an Autarch at range and then charge in and finish them off. Things like that. You also want to have a good amount of area denial in your list, whether that be a support Avatar of Cain with a cheeky Overwatch nearby, or, you know, you have something like D-cannons in your list to make sure that enemies are punished when they move too close. And you also want to have effective positioning. And I know that phrase right there is a little bit of a trigger to a lot of newer players because they're, you know, maybe a little bit more, you know, inexperienced at positioning your models. But basically what I mean by that, as far as your lone ops go, is you want to make sure that your lone ops are still on the objective, but far enough out of threat range to where opponents can't easily assault them and take the objective from you, or just simply out OC you on the objective. A lot of opponents will simply just out OC you, right? They'll just not engage with your lone op. They'll say, okay, well, I probably can't win combat against an Autarch Wayleaper with my unit of 5 infiltrators, but I can definitely out OC them, so I'm just going to move on to the objective. I'm going to shoot the Autarch Wayleaper, probably not kill him, and then just sit there and capture it, right? So there are other ways that an opponent can kind of get around lone operative and your, you know, lone operative being able to score on primary. So effective positioning is important. And again, this is where the other ingredients come in, right? The expendable screening units, the good target priority, being able to eliminate those units of infiltrators before they're actually able to do that can give you a very big leg up in the game. Now, there are some conditions that you do have to be wary of. You can't be going up against Thousand Suns and expect the same things to work with the same positioning, because Thousand Suns are pretty cheesy, you know? Doombolt, double Doombolt will easily kill your Autarch Wayleaper. It'll easily kill any of your characters, and, you know, it'll pop your Phoenix Gem as well. So do be careful about going up against Thousand Suns. And especially if you're going against good Thousand Suns players, they will be able to find those angles into your characters, and they will be able to pop them quite easily out in the open. So, you know, you might want to plan B against those types of lists, or just wait to use this until the late game where they really don't have the Cabal points necessary, you know, or the ritual points or whatever they're called, to be able to, you know, cast a double Doombolt at your Autarch or your different characters. Because they are just straight up mortal wounds. So essentially a 3+ will kill an Autarch Wayleaper. So the other condition is that you want to watch out for other abilities that get around lone op. There are several in the game that exist out there via units or other stuff like that. And you do want to look out for armies with large amount of fly in their lists. So you want to be able to screen deep and not wide versus fly. And essentially what that means is, instead of essentially deploying your Storm Guardians in a line across the battlefield, you deploy them deep. Maybe you deploy them in a column in between the enemy flying unit, like the enemy raider, for example, and the home objective. This is going to prevent the enemy raider from being able to get an optimal movement against your lone operative character on the objective. And oftentimes what will happen is it'll just prevent the Cobalite warriors, or, you know, whatever is in the raider, the witches, the incubi, from being able to get an easy charge on that Autarch Wayleaper. And also do remember that the Autarch Wayleaper with the Howling Banshee Mask has strikes first. So if an enemy unit charges you and the enemy unit is small and maybe a little bit fragile, like, you know, most Dark Eldar units, you can probably win that combat pretty handily. Alright, so I did want to show you guys how to position yourself for success when using your characters to score primaries. And again, I can't stress this enough. Your Wraith Blades are awesome. Your Avatar of Cain is awesome. But what happens when your Avatar of Cain goes down early? Do you just kind of give up on primaries and go for a Gambit or something like that and say, oh well, I guess I can't score primaries anymore, right? Well, obviously not. That's going to be a huge disadvantage to you. So you want to be able to adapt accordingly. And it all comes down to positioning, where you position your units. You can actually get away with quite a lot with an Autarch Wayleaper. You wouldn't think it, but the Autarch Wayleaper with the Phoenix Gem is actually pretty durable and is a good character. Decent range attack with the Dragon Fusion Gun and pretty good combat with the Starglaive. So for these examples, we're going to be using 2 different terrain layouts. I wanted to show you guys something different this time around, and we will be branching out into different types of terrain and deployment layouts. So we're going to be using terrain layout number 1, and we're going to be using Dawn of War deployment for the first part of it. This is the terrain layout we've used for most of our videos so far. But we're also going to use terrain layout number 3 with diagonal deployment. The name is escaping me right now, but if anyone knows it, you can tell me in the comments. But this terrain layout is, diagonal deployment across the long way of the table. And we're using a different terrain layout. This terrain layout has a little bit more terrain on the board edges, so there's a little bit less line of sight there. And there's also a little bit less line of sight on the middle of the table. So the firing lanes are not as big as terrain layout number 1. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to show you guys was the screening that you guys need to do to make sure that your characters can score on primary. So one of the biggest weaknesses of this strategy is that characters have really low OC. That means enemy units that move on there, even the lowly Rhino, is going to be able to out-OC an Autarch Wayleaper, a Death Jester, or Fuegan. So to prevent this, you have to use units proactively. Typically, units like Storm Guardians or Rangers are really good at this because they can kind of muck up enemy units and spread out really far so that enemy units can't move past them effectively to be able to get onto objectives. And remember, your opponent doesn't have to kill your Autarch Wayleaper to eliminate this strategy from working. They just need to out-OC you. So being able to block enemies from getting onto the objective in the first place and then just throwing an Autarch Wayleaper on there is a pretty good strat. Now, the reason why I said Storm Guardians here is because Storm Guardians actually have sticky objectives and are probably going to be in this position anyway, so screening with them is, an obvious choice when it comes to what to do on your second turn. So essentially, on your second turn, granted that these Storm Guardians survived in any great numbers, and even if only 6 are left or 5 are left, it's usually enough to screen out a large portion of enemy forces. So what you do is after you stickify the left-hand side objective, you're going to move your Storm Guardians forward to block enemy units so that they can't possibly get on the objective themselves. What this is mostly going to mean is it's going to mean an advance roll, and it's going to mean spreading your Storm Guardians out as much as possible. This will be able to block enemy infantry without fly, but also vehicles without fly. And again, remember what I told you guys about flying transports and flying units. If you screen deep instead of wide, oftentimes you can mess up their movement just enough to where they're not going to be able to shoot your Autarch Wayleaper and also assault them. So yes, do keep that in mind, especially with units like Rangers that can move D6 after you end a move within 9 inches of them. But also Storm Guardians as well because they just have more models. So after your Storm Guardians move up and screen, do their thing, maybe they take some pot shots at something, then you move your Autarch Wayleaper onto the objective. So the objective is sticky. The Autarch Wayleaper is screening for deep strikers while in this position, and you will have firm control on that objective. Even if they manage to kill the Autarch Wayleaper with the roll of a 1 on the Phoenix Gem, you will still have control because Storm Guardians had your back and they made that objective sticky. The other thing to keep in mind on this specific terrain layout is that the Autarch Wayleaper can simply phantasm back behind that ruin. You'll probably need to roll a 2 at least to be able to do that, but that is very possible. And then, of course, the Autarch Wayleaper can be a little bit out of line of sight and not on the objective. So you still have a sticky objective, but your opponent might not be in charge range to be able to actually cap that objective from the Autarch Wayleaper, which is a fantastic way to bait your opponent into wasting some of their units. Now, the other thing I want to show you requires a little bit of setup, but it's very effective. I've done this in a couple of my games. Now, the reason I haven't talked about it a ton on the channel is because it does cost a lot of command points, and, an opponent that knows the trick will be able to just ignore it. But the great thing is, if they ignore it, then you're scoring primary objectives. So you kind of win either way. And in an ideal situation, your opponent will know that you can do this and won't go for it, and then you can save some command points. So again, win-win. So what is this strategy? So basically what you do here is you put an Autarch Wayleaper on one of the side objectives in the middle of the battlefield. It needs to be a side objective because of the unit we're going to have come in via rapid ingress. And basically we're going to set up a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation where the assault unit really does want to get into combat with the Autarch Wayleaper because they easily have the kill there and the objective. But if they do, you can come in via rapid ingress at the end of the movement phase, and you can countercharge with heroic intervention. This is a 3 command point commitment, so you do need to kind of plan this out beforehand. It's not something that you can just use willy-nilly, but it's very effective. You have a unit like Howling Banshees, and now Howling Banshees are a unit that not a lot of people like and are genuinely seen as one of the worst units in the Eldar Index. However, they do have fights first, and when using characters to score objectives in this way, they can be really useful. In fact, in this particular example, we don't even really need to put the Banshees in reserve. It does give them some tactical flexibility, but if we're just banking on using this strategy, we can always just deploy them right behind that wall at a line of sight so that they can heroically intervene after, right? So instead of using 3 command points, you're only now using 2. Now your opponent is in a bit of a bad situation because first of all, if they do assault in, they're going to be fighting last because the Autarch Wayleaper and the Banshees both have fights first. This also works with the Visarch leading a unit of Harlequins, which, while definitely more expensive, is arguably a lot more damage dealing. So basically what happens is the assault unit just charges in anyway. What choice do they have? They might as well try at this point. You've kind of baited them into this. So once they charge in with their unit, the Autarch Wayleaper will do their damage. The Howling Banshees will do their damage. Yes, they can interrupt for 2 command points. That is true. But, after the Autarch or the Banshees fight, there's probably going to be a lot less models in that unit, and your opponent might just not think it's worth it at that point. And then after that unit is destroyed or, cut down to like 1 model or something like that, you can consolidate further onto the objective and the enemy model. Of course, you do have to base the enemy model if possible, but that's great because the enemy model's on an objective, and that means you will out OC that enemy unit and capture the objective for yourself at the beginning of your next turn. So this does require a little bit of setup. Again, it does require you take something with fights first, but I think we're seeing more people take Howling Banshees and take things with fights first like the Visarch for this exact reason. People are finding ways to be able to deal with things like Wraith Blades and the Avatar of Cain. So this is our kind of backup plan. If the Wraith Blades don't work out, if the Avatar of Cain dies early because your opponent is prepared for it, then we can always, of course, score primaries with strategies like this. All right, so I did want to show you guys an example from terrain layout number 3 as well. In this example, we have a Autarch Wayleaper on an objective, but he's not in plain view. He's actually behind that wall. Now, a lot of opponents will still be able to get to them, but they won't actually be able to target him with range attacks, even if they're within 12 inches, unless they're on the other side of the wall, because of course the wall blocks true line of sight. Now, we do have another unit really close to the Autarch Wayleaper behind the ruins, so they also can't be shot at. This is primarily going to be something like Howling Banshees or the Visarch with some Quins, something with fights first, or in some cases, even Jane Czar. I've actually been warming up a little bit to Jane Czar as of late using this strategy. And the reason for this is because Jane Czar uses heroic intervention for free when targeting her own unit, which of course is herself. And that's huge, right? Because she also has fights first. So you can hide her solo behind a wall, out of line of sight. Something can charge into your Autarch Wayleaper or something like that, and Jane Czar can come screaming in to support for free. This is 9 times out of 10 going to be more than enough to deal with whatever infantry your opponent throws at you, short of units with really heavy armor or invulns like Terminators. So then, of course, after you fight that unit and destroy them, you can consolidate back a little bit onto the objective. So that's really good because obviously the objective remains under your control and your enemy still cannot shoot you because you are still behind that wall. And due to the new ruling by the WTC on units charging, into ruins essentially, they can count as using the barricade rules when determining engagement. So they'll actually have a 2-inch engagement, which is fine because that means you can still strike them back and you can still do a ton of damage to them. And afterwards, because they charged you and it's your turn next, you can easily just consolidate right onto the objective anyway. So either way, you're going to be able to, recapture that objective from your opponent and score those primaries. And yeah, so this is basically a great way of also denying your opponent an easy primary objective and using a character or a couple of characters in the case of, Jane Czar and an Autarch Wayleaper to prevent enemies from being able to actually kill them in combat. And of course, they're going to be mostly hidden anyway by the Wall of the Ruin. And really in this case, the only thing to look out for is indirect fire. So, there is a counter to that though, and that is rapid ingress. So you can do the same thing with Jane Czar that you can do with Howling Banshees, but you can obviously use Heroic Intervention for free, so it's not as much of a tax on CP. So you can come in Strategic Reserve, that places you roughly in the same spot, and you should be able to make an easy charge from there. So in conclusion, with clever positioning and friendly units in tow ready to support, lone operatives and characters can be extremely difficult to remove from objectives and can boost your primary game considerably. Definitely keep this in mind when building your lists and positioning your units on the battlefield. Being able to force your opponent to deal with multiple hard-to-take objectives can give you a huge advantage in the primary game, right? So unless you're fighting against an opponent who can get to all 3 objectives before you can, and that's assuming you have nothing to prevent that, like Rangers or anything like that, the power of being able to just move an Autarch Wayleaper up the battlefield, towing the objective, and forcing your opponent to come to you so that you can rip them apart through various means, through the Howling Banshee counterstrike that I spoke of, or just your other units that are going to support you. That can be a really hard thing for an opponent to deal with. And, the more resources you force your opponent to allocate to situations like this where they have a very little chance of actually being able to overpower the Wayleaper and take the objective from it, the better off you're going to be across the battlefield. Again, those units aren't targeting your Fire Dragons, your Shadow Specters, your Warp Spiders, whatever it is. They're going after an Autarch Wayleaper because most enemy armies, most tough enemy armies are going to need to be able to have that primary objective advantage on you. Because the Eldar are extremely good at scoring secondary objectives, so really the only place an enemy can beat you is primary objectives. And if those tough armies aren't scoring primaries, then, chances are they're going to lose pretty bad. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and thank you so much to all my Patreons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. We finally hit 4K subscribers, which is awesome, so thank you so much for that. And if you guys want to support the channel, I have free trials activated on my Patreon, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategies, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. It's a really awesome place. I'm very active on it. We have a lot of active Eldar players that are more than happy to help new players out and veterans alike. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, or you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel on the channel store page, I will leave the links for those in the description as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.